mermaid found a swimming lad, picked him for her own, pressed her body to his body, laughed, and plunging down, forgot in cruel happiness that even lovers drown. You're listening to Carolina Haints. Welcome, dear listeners, to the 5th season of the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. There's been a lot of talk lately about media bias and cancel culture and the like, but none of these things are new concepts. Unfortunately, the internet and social media have made it easier and faster to spread these hate-filled sentiments, and to do so with near anonymity. And it's led to the divisive America we have today. We divide ourselves across economic lines, political beliefs, religious faith, the color of our skin, the nationality of our heritage, anything and any way we can find to pick sides against one another. And whether or not some of these movements are justified or warranted, they can be blemished by those who take things too far. The fanatics, the extremists. Whether you believe it's fueled by a political figure or the media, the result is the same: a further divided nation. Now, we aren't a political podcast, and as I said, none of these concepts are new. Take, for example, the racial riots of 1867 in Charleston, South Carolina, over the enslavement of a mermaid. Or at least that's how the newspapers reported it. In reality, there was no riot, there was no mermaid, and it wasn't racially motivated. The John Lining House is believed to be the oldest frame residence in Charleston. Records are scarce, but it was built sometime between 1694 and 1715. In 1757, the house was purchased by Dr. John Lining and presented to his wife, Sarah. And even though there are no medical records indicating that the Linings ever lived in the house, it still bears their name today. John Lining had absolutely nothing to do with the alleged riots that occurred over 100 years after his death. But he was quite the historical figure in his own right. Lining was not only a physician, but a well-respected scientist. He was particularly interested in weather phenomena and recorded the first weather observations in 1738. He corresponded with Benjamin Franklin during the period that Franklin was conducting his famous experiments with electricity. But Lining's most significant medical achievement was a dissertation on yellow fever in America. He was a justice of the Court of General Sessions, president of the Charleston Library Society, and founder of the St. Andrew's Society. And Lining died of a stroke in 1760. For the next 100-plus years, the house exchanged ownership several times, and when the Civil War ended, it was purchased by Dr. William Trott. During the war, most of the city had been devastated. In the early years of the war, fire had ravaged a large portion of the city. But it was the Second Battle of Charleston Harbor when Union forces bombarded the city with artillery for the 19 months of the war. By the time the war ended, virtually every building in Charleston had been damaged, but the John Lining House had been one of the lucky ones. The worst damage it received was that its doors had been blown off their hinges from a nearby artillery shell. Trott bought the home with the intent of opening an apothecary in part of the building. He opened his business in the spring of 1867. Trott was convinced that the apothecary would be successful. However, in his first week of business, he only received one customer. He asked the customer why no one was coming to his shop, and she explained that there was a root worker in the community. She said that it wasn't personal. It was just a matter of tradition. The Gullah people were accustomed to going to root doctors, and change came slowly. Economics were also a factor. The war may have ended slavery, but it didn't open a lot of opportunity for the newly freed slaves. Thousands of Charleston residents still struggled to survive financially in the post-war years. But Trott was a businessman, and he felt that the market was strong enough to support both the root worker and his apothecary. So, he started thinking of ways that he could get people to come into his shop. If he could get them in the door, he was sure they would buy something. Trott was from New York and recalled the story of P.T. Barnum and the Fiji Mermaid. Some years earlier, Barnum had acquired an artifact from a Japanese fishing boat for his famous sideshow. Barnum advertised this thing as a mermaid. In reality, it was a grotesque hoax. It was the shriveled up, mummified torso of a monkey sewn onto the tail of a large fish. Of course, the hoax didn't fool people for long, but that didn't stop them from perpetrating similar hoaxes for the next 30 years. And most importantly, to Trott, it had worked. The lure of the Fiji Mermaid brought thousands of people to see Barnum's exhibits. Thousands of disappointed people, but people nonetheless. And Trott was confident that all he needed was people in the door. So, he devised a plan. He closed the shop for a week and put up a sign that when he opened the following weekend, there would be a free magic show. He had several aquariums built and filled them with all manner of fish and local plant life. That may not sound all that exciting today, but in 1867, aquariums were a rarity. It worked. People flocked into the shop to view the aquariums, but Trott saved the best for last. He had a large aquarium in the back of the store covered with a tarp. He told the crowd that the specimen inside this tank was very sensitive to light, so he could only reveal it for a few seconds. He pulled back the sheet to show a tank with dark, murky water. The crowd gathered around, and the closest among them could make out some plant swaying in the water, and something else.
A mermaid!
Someone in the crowd exclaimed. The rest of the crowd gasped and leaned in closer, but Trott quickly covered the tank back up, saying that the few seconds he promised them was over. In reality, of course, there was no mermaid, and the man who claimed to see it was being paid to say so. Rumor quickly spread that Dr. Trott had a mermaid, a real, live mermaid. The root doctor heard about the story and was outraged. It wasn't the loss of business that bothered her. After all, Trott was right. There was plenty of business for them both. No, she was upset because the Gullah considered the mermaids to be nature spirits. They were thought to be able to cause shipwrecks and storms when angered. The root worker warned that something terrible would happen if Trott didn't return the maiden to the sea. Trott just laughed. Business was finally starting to pick up. There was no way he was going to give up the hoax this soon. He refused. And then the rain started. It seemed like it would never stop. It rained that night and into the next day, and the next, and the next. The Charleston Daily News at the time wrote the following, quote, "Day after day and night after night have the floods descended until patience has been exhausted. and forbearance ceased to be a virtue. The oldest inhabitant does not remember a more continued spell of wet weather." End quote. No, the Root Doctor didn't curse him, and neither did the mermaid exact its revenge on Charleston. Because, after all, there was no mermaid. It was a hurricane, and even though it was only a Category 1, the weather conditions caused it to stall just off the coast of South Carolina. It stayed stationary for nearly a week and pounded the city with wind and rain. Soon, the city started to flood, and word spread that Trot and his mermaid were to blame. Public fury rose. The Gullah turned to the city council, and the city served Trot with a citation that said if he did not release the mermaid, he would face hefty fines and even serve time in jail. And then a little boy drowned trying to save his dog from the floodwater. The Root Doctor claimed that the entire city could sink into the sea if Trot didn't release his captive. This prompted a crowd of 500 people to meet and protest in front of Trot's shop. Trot was dumbfounded by the entire ordeal. What could he do? He told the crowd he couldn't set the mermaid free because it didn't exist. He invited them inside to see for themselves, but just as he pulled the cover off the mermaid tank, the roof collapsed due to the storm. It shattered the tank and pelted those closest to it with glass and debris. The contents of the aquarium mixed with the storm water that rushed out of the store and into the street. One man cried out that he saw the mermaid swim away in the wreckage of the shop. Trot seized the opportunity to defuse the situation and looked to the Root Doctor. She simply said that they would know soon enough, once the water spirit reached the sea. Less than a minute later, according to legend, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. Satisfied, the root worker dispersed the crowd, and everything went back to normal. The incident is generally referred to as the Mermaid Riot of 1867. However, it wasn't a riot. It was a group of peaceful protesters. No one burned anything to the ground, no property was damaged by the mob, no policemen were accosted. The only injuries were caused by the storm itself, but that didn't stop newspapers as far away as New York City referring to it as a racially motivated violent riot. Another important aspect of the story to take note of is the fact that this group, comprised mostly of Black Americans, had a grievance and went to their community leaders, who listened. The city issued papers ordering Trot to release the mermaid, and this was just a couple of years after the Civil War. In the city that most say the war began. The Charleston City paper ran an article about, quote, the mermaid incident, end quote, in October of 2015. They do a much better job of summing up the incident than I could. The article interviews Ross Michael Brown, an associate professor of history and African American studies at Southern Illinois University. Brown states that the, quote, story emphasized that the people rose because of the mermaid, and the city acted on the behest of the African descended community to ensure the release of the mermaid and the end of the public crisis. End quote. According to Brown, while this incident didn't address a particular political or economic injustice, the story of the mermaid represents an early example of African descended people rising up, demanding a response, and getting what they asked for. Although the newspapers' account for the mermaid incident makes no mention of any acts of violence or destruction, later retellings would refer to the event as the Mermaid Riots. For Brown, this shows that the retellings of the story were just as much about political power as the event itself. Quote, "For people of African descent, especially with a strong Central African, more specifically Congo background, the mermaids are representations of forms of nature spirits. These nature spirits, among many things, are political symbols." End quote. The mermaids are representations of forms of nature spirits. These nature spirits, among many things, are political symbols, says Brown. They often embody a lot of meaning within the political cultures of not only Congo societies, but related societies in the diaspora. We would tend to look at this and classify it as folklore, or as Bennett does, a superstition or something like that. But it's culture. End quote. According to Brown, the point of the tale of the Charleston Mermaid is to serve as a critique of enslavement. But the story also shows how supernatural legends allow cultures to address larger issues. The story taps into the power of political action and the idea that there will be a reckoning when freedom is denied. Quote, "The ways that people in the past talked about, remembered, and then did something, made statements and actions about the world around them. They often did it in cultural tropes. The idea of centering a social protest around a mermaid doesn't make sense to us, I suppose. But it made perfect sense back then because that was connected to an older and wider African-based worldview," he says. "We often sometimes rely on our need to talk about things in spiritual terms, where we translate very immediate, everyday concerns into a spiritual idiom, because it's a way of conveying the power of those concerns that maybe otherwise people would ignore." End quote. The John Lining House operated as an apothecary until 1960. To learn more about this story, check out the Mermaid Incident in the Charleston City paper from 2015. There's also charleston.com, charlestonterrors.com, and sceneencyclopedia.com. This show was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. I'd like to thank you for returning to the 5th season of the Carolina Hates podcast. You can find this show on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or YouTube. Every episode is also available at carolinahaints.libsyn.com. You can find everything about this show and the Carolina Haints book at our website, carolinahaints.com. Don't forget to like our official Facebook page at facebook.com/carolinahaints. You can follow us on Instagram at Recover Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. You can find everything that Jeff's up to at adarkerworld.com. And as always, you can learn more about our ongoing projects at recoverproductions.com. Please take a minute to subscribe to this show, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Everyone has that friend that loves creepy stories, so take a minute and share it. This show's listenership has grown dramatically over the past 4 seasons, so let's keep it going. You can reach out to me directly at recoverproductions@gmail.com. I love hearing from listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.